Hello, everyone. I'm Rose Gerber, COA's Director of Patient Advocacy and Education. I hope your new year is off to a great start. Before I introduce today's guests, I have two exciting milestones that I'd like to share with you. This year marks the third year of our CPAN Advocacy Chat Series. And as many of you know, and for those of you who don't know and are joining us for the first time, the purpose of this Advocacy Chat Series is to bring you updated information on healthcare and policy news that impacts cancer patients and their providers. And what's extra special about this is that that news is always delivered to you by industry experts. And another piece of very, very big and very exciting news is this year COA is celebrating our 20th anniversary. So we, on behalf of COA, would like to thank all of you, our members who have supported us from the very, very early years founding of COA to today. So thank you very much. Today, our special guests are Ted Okon, COA Executive Director, and Nick Ferreyros, COA's Managing Director of Policy, Advocacy, and Communications. Ted and Nick, thank you for being with us today. To get started, Ted and Nick, this year we have seen a lot of changes in DC after the congressional elections. Can you help our audience understand what the political landscape looks like and how you see the midterm elections and current environment in DC shaping cancer policy? And before you start answering that long question, I want to remind all of our participants that they're welcome to send you questions in the chat box. So Nick and Ted, go ahead and get started. Thank you.
I guess I'll start off, Rose, by saying that, go no further than I'm sure what everybody has seen going on in the headlines about trying to elect a Speaker of the House of Representatives, to show you how contentious this is, not just Republican versus Democrat, but within the Republican Party. It was really very tense, almost came to fisticuffs. But I think that gives a preview of what is going to happen here in the Congress. I'm the eternal optimist, so I am hoping that actually in the House of Representatives, even in the Senate, the very thin majority in the House that the Republicans have and the thin majority that the Democrats have in the Senate, that may actually help more bipartisan initiatives, hopefully, among or between sort of the different parties and the more moderate people within those parties. But again, that's speaking as the eternal optimist. That's speaking as an American who doesn't think in terms of parties, but thinks in terms of Americans. Before I hand it over to Nick, let me give you a couple of things. I know we're going to talk about some of the things that COA popularly talks about in terms of hospital pricing, 340B, PBMs, and some other things. But I actually think that we had a major breakthrough last year in the Congress, and actually with the Democrats, who traditionally only want to talk about drug pricing as a pharmaceutical problem. And we saw over in the Senate hearings that actually hammered the PBMs. We see literally more people on the Democratic side doing that. And frankly, as Nick will talk about, there's been a tremendous amount of press, not only on PBMs, but on something as Nick would like to say wonky as 340B. I'm actually believe that in the House of Representatives, especially the Energy and Commerce Committee, I think you're going to see a lot of attention paid to 340B and PBMs. And what I'm hoping is that we can get some bipartisan action, because I can tell you, look, drug pricing starts with the drug pricers, the manufacturers. But basically what an American pays for drugs, their cost is not just dependent on the price, and sometimes is irrelevant of the price, as crazy as that sounds. It has to deal with basically the markup on the hospital side or the PBM. It has to deal with what the patient's benefit design is. So there are a lot of factors, but my crystal ball is that we are going to see more of the issues that we talk about come out of the Republican-controlled House. And I think, frankly, you're going to see some Democrats on the Senate, Senator Wyden, Cantwell, others, that are going to basically look closer at PBMs. We need a little bit of a breakthrough on 340B, but as Nick can talk about, some of the press has actually woken up some of the Democrats, like Senator Kaine in Virginia, after you read a very adverse investigative report in the New York Times. So Nick, maybe you want to sort of embellish on some of these.
I mean, I think, I would largely agree with what you said, Ted. We're in a very different environment than we were just a year ago. Especially now we have a divided Congress, but on very razor thin margins. You have this separate caucus, a minority caucus within the Republicans that are seeking to advance their own issues, and that portends a very rocky road ahead for anything really getting done. I mean, I think we might be going back to the 2008 era of Congress where not much is actually happening, but there's a lot of bluster and noise going on. But I think you really nailed it on the head, is where I think we're going to see most action is going to be on the committee side. And real meaningful action. There's a lot of attention being paid on these issues that we've been talking about for a very long time, and a lot of new data and a lot of new spotlights coming out. You talked about the media. We have never seen. You would never expect 340B to be on the Sunday New York Times, and now here it is. You would never expect 5-6 pages to be dedicated to 340B and hospital pricing in the Wall Street Journal over multiple stories. The words PBM are not exactly things that roll off your tongue, but now I have my wife shaking her fist whenever I say it, because we've managed to get them to drink the Kool-Aid, but it's happening across the country. In consumer publications, and moving away from not just the trade industry, which we at COA really focus on as well. So it's going to be a very interesting year. I also think we're going to see a lot administratively. What that means. We're coming out of the Inflation Reduction Act last year and the passage of that, and as Ted said, the bottom line is what a consumer pays for their healthcare when they come out. And bills like the Inflation Reduction Act are good for headlines. They're good for stump speeches during election years. But the actual impact on the bottom line, for what you and I are going to pay when we swipe our credit card, is so minimal and or so far away that we're not going to see it. So all of that, all of the media attention, all of the bills that passed last year that everyone, campaigned on, I think that's going to drive a lot, and the divided Congress, it's going to drive a lot of how we see everything shake up in Washington this year.
And, let me just underscore something that Nick said, Rose, and that is the fact that you listen to a lot of things that have come out of what the Republicans want to change. But part of the problem with this electing Speaker McCarthy wasn't really directed at him, was directed at the process. And I want to just very briefly say, a lot of members of Congress on both sides of the aisle want regular order. What does regular order mean? That means that everything comes out of the committee, just what Nick said. And they don't want to have leadership plop a 15,000-page bill on their doorstep and expect them to vote on it the next day. They want to be well briefed and come out of leadership. So some of the points that have made, and this has been betrayed as this MAGA rabble-rouser, but there are members of Congress that feel very strongly about that. Why is that important? That goes back to what Nick said, that when you have more things come out of committee and committee debate, you get more representatives involved. That allows us to basically touch those representatives, inform those representatives in an advocacy point, and they have more clout in the process that when, a few people are involved with staff of crafting a bill and, the regular member of Congress throws up their hands and says, well, I can't do anything about it. So sorry, Rose.
Oh, no, not at all. I think you've both done a really great job with an overview, and kudos to our audience. I know that there's a lot of individuals in our audience that are very sophisticated and might be very familiar with government relations or just policy issues. But just for the benefit of anyone who might be very new to these issues, can either one of you just give like a quick, short, almost an elevator speech version of what we're talking about with PBMs, 340B, and even Ted, your reference to benefit design for patients, how that translates to like patient issues?
Yeah, maybe Nick and I can sort of take one at the other. Let me talk about one of my favorite topics, 340B, and then Nick can talk about one of his, the PBMs. You know, everybody hears 340B, and all these hospitals run around and say, wait a minute, this is pharma. This doesn't cost anybody. It doesn't do anything. Well, I'll tell you what, here's the problem. The problem is that these big mega health systems are making, when I talk about hundreds of millions of dollars, literally up to $500 million a year in drug discounts, what happens is they're not only not giving those drug discounts to patients in need, but they're marking up the drugs, as our recent study. And by the way, if you haven't seen it, go on the COA website. It's a headline. Look at our recent study on hospital drug pricing, 5 times. So when you talk about a very expensive $5,000, $10,000 drug, you're talking about a markup from $25,000 to $50,000 on the commercial insurance side. So what gets portrayed as, oh, this is just pharma paying it out of their pocket. The problem is no one's getting the benefit except the hospital CEO. So not only are patients not getting the benefit, sharing some of those discounts and the share of those discounts, but they're seeing a tremendous markup. So what does that mean? That means when we talk about the drug price, there's just no relationship between the drug price and what the the average American is paying on the commercial side. So when you hear this 340B, you really need to think about that. And the other thing is, I really encourage everybody to read the New York Times article out of Richmond, what 340B is about, how it's not benefiting the community, and also read the Wall Street Journal article that came out, unfortunately, the day after Christmas, but basically is a brilliant article in terms of looking at communities all across the country. And the bottom line is the discounts from this program are fueling drug prices. They're not helping the average American with their drug costs, and they're not helping communities in need.
Yeah, I'll piggyback off that. And we just got a question that said the chat's disabled. Yeah, all questions that come through Q&A. So please, if you want to type them in, please do that and we'll answer. I'm going to piggyback off of Ted and add a little bit more. You hear 340B, you hear hospitals, you hear markup, and you think, oh, how does that affect me? Well, when you go to the hospital and you get a treatment, even if it's not cancer related, anything, you go in for, you get a drug, there's a greater than 50% chance that hospital you are in is a 340B institution. Mm-hmm. When that happens, that institution bought that drug for 60% off. But that's maybe let's say 40%. We're giving them the benefit of the doubt. So it's a $100 drug. They bought it for $60. Then they sold it to you for $100. And yes, you have insurance, but your insurance is percentage based, and you have copays. So we're in January. We have a lot of cancer patients and survivors online. You remember when you got those first bills in January when your deductibles reset, right? So hospitals are not poor institutions for the most part. There are definitely those that are true important rural and safety net institutions that we care about a lot. But you have some of the largest institutions in this country, some of the most profitable institutions, far more profitable on these drug sales than even the drug makers themselves, that are making a lot of money. Ted talked about Bon Secours, and I just wrote down some of the headline numbers from here. Last year they made $1 billion in profits off 340B. They have $9 billion in reserves. How many of us have a $9 billion rainy day fund? They got also $440 million in tax breaks. Chances are good any hospital in your city doesn't pay taxes on their real estate holdings, and they're often some of the biggest, shiniest buildings in town. How are your home taxes? Who's funding your schools? Who's funding your roads? If they're not paying the taxes, you are. Also, remember, you're paying the marked up price for the drugs. So, there is no free lunch in this world. These things have a big difference. And then the purpose of 340B is to stretch scarce resources so that these institutions can treat more underserved and uninsured patient populations. Great idea, sounds good. It's a mantra they all hide behind. But the Bon Secours story is a perfect example, and I encourage you to go and read that. That was in the New York Times. They ended up, they're a big network. They have lots of hospitals across Richmond, Virginia. They signed up for 340B because of the hospital in the poor neighborhood. And then they took the money that they saved there, funneled it into hospitals in richer neighborhoods. And what that means is that those patients, fully insured, paid top dollar for their medications. And then they kept funneling all of the profits into the richer hospitals. And eventually the hospital that they originally qualified for was, running on fumes. They closed down essential services. And it was just a horrible, horrible story.
That is so important. Can you literally repeat that? Because, I want people to really understand what you just described. It is so important that what this hospital system is doing.
I will actually give you a
Take it
quote.
slow. It's really important.
I will give you a quote from a physician.
Okay.
Worked in the Richmond Community Hospital, the rundown hospital that Nick was talking about, that was not getting the benefit of those 340B dollars, but was the 340B hospital because it was in a very poor area. Those dollars went through that hospital, didn't upgrade that hospital, and went to upgrading hospitals in very wealthy areas of Richmond. And this physician, who is a former, I think he'd worked in the ER, said it was like laundering money. Okay. You know what the mob does? The mob launders money through a bank or a business or an institution that is supposedly reputable, and it launders money to the mob. This is talking about laundering money, not supporting this hospital in a poor area, a rundown, dilapidated hospital that was not basically working, but literally put that out into and made the dollars off of very wealthy areas. This is just borderline criminal.
Now we have one question: is why aren't insurance companies fighting 340B?
Well, it's very interesting because the insurance companies and the big insurance companies this gets us into another topic, PBMs, pharmacy benefit managers. And more, these large pharmacy benefit managers have become 340B contract pharmacies. And what they realize is by having the drugs go to their, and when I say contract pharmacy, I'm not just talking about, the 800 CVS stores around the country or whatever the number is. I'm talking about literally, and it's probably thousands, I'm talking about their mail order pharmacies, the PBM mail order specialty pharmacies. And again, there's data on this. We don't have time and 30 minutes to go into it, but basically they are racking in 340B dollars. So why would the insurance companies want to turn that off? Mm-hmm. I think who's really becoming aware of this are the employers that are hiring the insurance companies. And more, the employers, certainly the groups that represent them, are starting to realize that this 340B is really a flim-flam on the American public. And the bottom line is another flim-flam on the American public. And the bottom line is that who's making money off of this are the big institutions, the big health systems, and the PBMs that are owned by or owning the insurers. And one other thing, fast, and I'll flip it to Nick because I know we're going to run out of time. But as we talk and people say, what are the problems with PBMs? The problem with PBMs, they use rebates to fuel prices. We see a wide gap between the list price of the drug and the real net price of the drug, net these rebates that they get and rake in. They constantly are getting in the way of patients getting their medication. They want to run it through their mail order pharmacies. Why do they want to run it through their mail order pharmacies? Because more and more they're 340B contract pharmacies, rather than the patient getting their drug, whether it's an oral or an injectable, right there at the practice from the practice. And now the big topic is these copay accumulators, where basically the insurance company is literally taking the money in from any co-insurance that basically the patient gets from the drug company, and the patient still has to pay their deductible. So again, I'll stop here, but we have seen the convergence of PBMs and 340B, and it's really very scary.
Yeah, and this is not just a 340B webinar, right? So it's kind of a perfect example of how all these worlds start to come together. And we'll bring this back to the health policy in a second, but just like 340B is getting a lot of media attention, PBMs are now getting a lot of media attention, and a lot of that is really because of the patient impact. And people are starting to realize, members of Congress are starting to realize, it's not just, it used to hide behind the insurance company. Remember when our original battles were about pre-existing conditions. Well, now they let you have the pre-existing condition. They just grab and hold all the care away from you and make it very difficult for you to get it. Ted did a very good job of talking about how it's a muddy water where the 340B and PBM world sort of come together into one. We have this almost fully vertically integrated healthcare system that's starting to develop here, where the top insurers own the top PBMs, depends on who it is, owns one or the other. They own a specialty pharmacy, which often is where our cancer medications are dispensed. Some of the top insurers are now starting to become own doctors' practices in their own right. And you're starting to see that happen. And so it's a really tricky world. And just to give you a sense of the scale, right? Overall US healthcare spending around $4.1 trillion in the US. It sounds like a lot of money. It is. It's about 20% of our GDP. The PBM market, that's all the money that flows into PBMs, is 10%, more than 10% of that, $428 billion or $482 billion. I'm sorry. That's a lot of money in there, right? And so there's a lot of players in there that have a vested interest in it being complicated. And of that market, about 45 billion is 340B. That grows every year, of course. So we had a question of is why aren't insurance companies fighting it? It's because they're all sort of in the same swimming pool of money, as it were, and dealing with that. And Ted talked about PBMs. PBMs, I think that is probably, and Ted, let me know if you agree. I think that's probably where we're going to see some of the most action this year.
Yeah.
You've got the agencies, you have the FTC that launched an investigation into PBMs last year. Then in Congress, you have the various committees there. I think there's at least 3, if not 4 bills that were pretty strong towards the end of last year, towards the last Congress, that will have to be reintroduced, but several of their champions, all of the champions are still there. You have some of the most vocal PBMs and a former pharmacist in Buddy Carter, who is leading a lot of efforts. In fact, tomorrow, Buddy Carter is going to lead a listening session with members on TRICARE. And TRICARE, for those that don't know, is the health insurance program for our military active duty service members and veterans. And there was a very large PBM issue that started to emerge towards the end of last year. And thanks to the vocal efforts of a lot of patients and veteran groups, that got changed, but it's not permanent. And we like to say with PBMs, it's like playing a game of whack-a-mole. You deal with one problem over here, and they go and pop up somewhere else. So I think PBMs are where we're going to see it. And Ted talked about copay accumulators. That's an interrelated issue as well. We've seen for those who are in practices that are on the webinar, we've seen that emerge a lot, particularly with the cutoff of patient assistance programs, which is tied to the copay accumulator and maximizer issue, because these programs are being abused and that are then being used to just siphon away money. And so it messes up this tricky balance that we, as you know, as advocates for the practices, are just trying to maintain, you know, just getting patients the care that they need. And instead, you have these self-interested actors coming in and upsetting the apple cart so they can siphon a little bit more here, a little bit more there. Meanwhile, you know, oh yeah, well, you know, maybe it'll get figured out, but meanwhile, you've got cancer growing in you and you need it to be treated. So I think PBMs are rightly so a place where we're going to see a lot of the action this year.
So
Right.
I just wanted, you know, to kind of throw this out there. You've done a really good job of, you know, painting a visual for all of us. Ted, one of the things, you know, as the head of COA, you always talk about is we can address problems, but we want to also have solutions. So you briefly mentioned insurers and employers. Can you talk a little bit about COA's advocacy with integrating employers into some of these issues? And also for anyone in the audience, like what can we do? You talked a little bit about what Congress is going to do. What can we as advocates do? And when I say advocates, again, it can be anyone from a cancer patient, you know, getting chemo to the CEO of an organization. We're all advocates. What can we do?
Right. I think, Rose, a couple of things. Number one is that the world used to be 100 years ago that basically you would go to your doctor and you would pay your doctor, whether you gave your doctor chickens or money or whatever the case may be. The bottom line, it was you and your physician. You now have all these intermediaries that Nick just talked about. And basically, as a result of that, you know, you've got people that siphon off and actually increase the payment, increase costs for Americans for their drugs and basically for their related healthcare services. So what we're looking at doing is actually getting back to the model of getting closer to the patient directly one-on-one, because everybody has insurance. So instead of going to the insurance company, going right to the employer and having basically the employers realize that there are so many costs that are being ratcheted up by these intermediaries. And that's why COA has embarked on getting to know employers, the groups that represent them, and basically looking ultimately through its entity, NCTA, contract directly with employers. So that's one of the things we're doing. Number two, one of the things we're doing is you're going to see COA very active on these issues related to 340B, PBMs, and even the Inflation Reduction Act, which we don't have time to get into. Yeah. But the bottom line is that is everybody says, oh, this sounds great. We're going to negotiate drug prices. We're going to go down. Guess what? Number one, this is only for 60,000 Americans that have Medicare. Of those people that have Medicare, most have secondary insurance. So this isn't going to affect a very small percentage of the American public. And if you're a drug company and you're faced with the unknown that if you don't have competition down the road, that the government is going to negotiate, meaning price fix the thing down, what are you going to do? You're going to increase your launch prices on these drugs. So, and that affects all Americans. So the bottom line is, this whole thing about negotiating drug prices, the Inflation Reduction Act, this is the ultimate flim-flam, because the idea of this is not born in good economics and thought. It's about political messaging. So this year, we are going to be paying attention to that. We're going to be paying attention to a number of bills that will come out on the PBM arena, a number of bills that will come out on 340B. And you say, well, how do you fix 340B? It's really simple. You have the discount follow the patient, not ending up in some CEO's bonus or building a new building or putting a piano in a foyer. That and all that is realistic, has happened. So we're going to be doing that. The government is grossly overpaying for drugs, 340B hospitals. We're going to correct that. We're going to work on a number of PBM bills that you're going to see come out, something related to the Inflation Reduction Act. And then I know we're running out of time, but last but not least, we are all over this another experiment in oncology or cancer care, which is the Enhancing Oncology Model, which is coming out of the Innovation Center of CMS. So we're going to be very active. And to answer your question, Rose, what can people do? Stay tuned, because when we ask you to reach out, educate your representatives, which so many people have done and have already had a change in the TRICARE program that mentioned about, Nick, this is what advocacy is about. We will help deliver the understanding, what you should be saying, but you have to deliver the message.
And we need closing remarks, but one thing is to emphasize what Ted just said is every time you hear anybody act on this in Washington or in the media, it's because of the patient stories.
Right.
So patient, survivor, family member, caregiver, everyone,
Right.
even the individuals in practices, the stories are critically important. And they may be tiring, you may be sick of it, you have a million other things to do, but without those stories, these aren't real. These are just a food fight between big businesses. And so that's what people can do, is stay involved and share your stories.
Yeah, let me just answer real quick, Rose, too, because one of the Q&As basically asked about, these are all problems, but one of the biggest problems is that the PBMs and the associated insurance companies are really restricting the drugs Americans have access to their formulas. Absolutely is a problem. Some new data has come out of that showing what the large threes are excluding in terms of drugs. We are going to be all over that.
Yeah, that's really a patient issue. I know that, as a cancer patient, you want to be able to take the medication that your physician, your oncologist has prescribed for you, and then to find out that it's not going to be covered. That's very upsetting. So I do think, you've both done a really great job about remembering the patient, all of this. And I do think, like, whether it's all these major media publications or even some of the local state papers, that the average patient consumer is now, maybe they heard this terminology or 340B, PBMs, drug pricing, and it just goes over their head. But when they're at the counter and all of a sudden they have to spend, $200 on a copay, it really impacts them. So, thank you so much. And before we go to the very last slide, you've done a great job on your crystal ball predictions for 2023. Any last comments, Nick or Ted?
Oh, I would just say stay tuned, because I think Nick's absolutely right. You're likely to see more activity on PBMs, but we're going to push it up on 340B and some of the other issues as well, too. So,
and I think stay tuned too, because it's going to be a wild year.
that may be that Nick left with the understatement of the year, right there.
Of the day.
Well, we did start off this chat by saying, I hope that you're all having, that your New Year's off to a great start. And I hope you enjoyed learning some of this fresh new content. Speaking of Washington, D.C., we're excited to be back at the State of Community Oncology live at the National Press Club, which is actually one of my favorite venues. It's a great venue. And we'll be sharing a lot of our COA updates with various advocacy groups as well. So what that means is that we will not be having our regularly programmed advocacy chat in February, but we will be back in March. And COA posts news every day, literally every day, on our COA and our CPAN website. So a phrase you kept hearing today was stay tuned. And thank you again for supporting COA for the last 20 years, or if today was your first time joining a COA CPAN event, thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.